My favorite group of people to spend Friday afternoon with.
Yeah.
Only group of people to spend Friday afternoon with.
All right.
And it'd be a lot better if we were doing this in Paul's wine cellar.
Here, here.
You know,
Any wine cellar.
I'd go get a corkscrew if you guys would come over.
Well, I hope by mid-November there's a reason to raise a glass. I'm optimistic, and we've got not a ton of time on this Friday afternoon, so I'm going to suggest we just go ahead and jump right in. I don't see Salinger yet. I assume he's joining.
He said he would be here, yeah.
Yeah, I talked to him a little earlier today, and he was in rainy Malheur County and had already had a flat tire today. So he's had his hands full so far.
Man on the move.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we all need to wait for Bob. Jeff, I'm hoping, since in some ways you've done the work of trying to pull together. I mean, Bob had a fair amount of ideas, coming out of the last meeting, and I think had some discussions with folks. Jeff, you had a number of discussions with different folks, and I think tried to take what you had heard from Bob and others and try to at least integrate it into a document. I prefaced what I sent with you all and want to say, before we dig into items, I think it's 4 through 7 in the legislative concept, that items 1 through 3, and I said this again in the email, but just because they're blank, don't think that the work that you did on the mission vision stuff was forgotten. There's some pieces that will need to be updated, and we'll do that based on the results of this conversation and work over the coming weeks. But we will integrate that stuff that you've agreed to already, and get that into the concept as well. With that said, before we pull up the document itself, anybody have any updates or things they want to share with the group? All right, let's pull it up.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Hey, Jenna, I just had Peggy Lynch, who's been following us pretty closely, was struggling to get on. Would you email her the link so that, just in case she's using the wrong one?
Yeah, she's got the right one now.
She does? Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So I'm more just going to be the navigator, not the, I don't have positions to present. I can explain some of what is here with context, or Peter, you want me to go through just real quickly, kind of touch on 4 through 7, and then you'll lead a discussion on all of it after I've touched on? Is that what you want me to do?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Why don't you do, high level on all of the new elements, and then we're going to circle back to the top and we'll get feedback from everybody.
Okay, great. So 1 through 3 doesn't, as Peter said, was not meant to replace anything that the work that had been done before, just that's all in the parking lot and needs to be plugged in. The focus was really on 4 through 7. What we did was come up with 2 options, because that integrated the thinking that we had seen in a couple of directional ways. Option A, I would characterize as the biggest thing is it's got a single executive director that reports to and is supervised by the Dean of the College of Forestry. That executive director works with the board of directors, but is supervised and is a university employee. that individual would be responsible for everything that's happening on the forest, operations, research, recreation programs, education. They would oversee the forest. They would work with the board and be responsible for preparing documents that are decision documents for the board of directors. And those are articulated there in like the fourth bullet. There may be more, there may be less, but that was the breadth of the responsibility for interacting with the board on that. And then responsible as a single place, the university through that executive director would be responsible for the day-to-day operations, budgets, execution, stakeholders, all of that. The other key piece of option A really then is the board of directors. That's the same as it is for option B. And then the state land board mission and role is the same. And functionally, what we're floating in this structure is that the board of directors is the decision maker on the particulars of the documents that are prepared for and executed by the executive director. State land board's not a decision maker, but that the state land board is there to be called on by the board or OSU. This also isn't firm. It could be a different configuration, but is available to provide some guidance or dispute resolution, or if things are just frozen up and there's a need, either the board or OSU says this just isn't working, we're kind of needing a little bit of a push or a guidance or some kind of input, that the state land board would be available for that call to do that. And then that would be in the form of policy guidance that would be for the board of directors to execute and make decisions, not the state land board making the decision. The main difference between option A and option B is that option B takes the role of the executive director that's in option A and divides it. And at least the intent under option B was that there would be an executive director that would report to and be supervised by the board of directors and would be responsible for day-to-day operations of the forest and the implementation of programs on the forest, working in collaboration with a research director that would be an OSU employee who would be responsible for the research program planning and implementation, and would be an expectation of collaboration on preparing and between those two on preparing and submitting annual budgets and plans that have to be approved by the board of directors. Responsibilities of the board of directors are the same in both option A and option B. Responsibilities of the land board or role of the land board is the same in option A and option B. So it really is the difference in the reporting to the board of directors and the structure for program implementation.
Say that
That's
again, Jeff.
big key.
So highlight the differences again one more time. And
I think that the difference really is in the responsibilities for preparing decision documents for the board and implementation of programs. And in option A, it sits with one individual who works for the university, and option B, the operations and program implementation sits with an executive director that's responsible directly to the board of directors, but works with a research program director that is an OSU employee and is responsible for implementing the research and collaborating on the preparation of the budgets and operation plans and things like that.
so in option B, is the executive director then under the hire of the board, or
Yes.
still an OSU employee?
No, it's reports and supervised by the board of directors. So option B is an executive director that is the employee of the board of directors of the entity.
Got it. Thanks.
You know, you speak of option B as being this collaboration. That's a noble goal. But what I see is two entities with possibly very separate goals, and and not so much collaboration. I'm a firm believer that there needs to be a hierarchy. There needs to be somebody in charge, and I think option A is much more realistic and much more workable. Person needs to work for OSU, but they need to have the decision-making ability to run the forest.
And without advocating for either option, Paul, I'm glad you said what you said. I probably wasn't clear enough that under option B, the executive director is in charge of the forest. The research programs being operated would be operated by the research director, but and with an expectation of partnership, but ultimately the executive director would report to the board of directors and be responsible for that forest. I'm saying that without asking or advocating for option B. But we were thinking about that when we put it together, that ultimately you have to have somebody that is responsible for implementing the direction of the board.
Jeff, in option A, is it imagined or beneath the surface that with an executive director, they would designate someone to be the research director as well? Because those are two pretty large chunks of responsibility. But it's not delineated here, but is that where OSU or that folks would imagine that to occur?
We didn't dig into that.
Okay.
We left that, the formation of staff and what staff there would be and all of that as a responsibility of the board of directors and the executive director in option A.
Okay, thanks.
Katie,
Yeah,
did you have
Keith,
something?
Keith, I would just add in kind of the original plan, I think that was really the setup where you have kind of the executive of the forest, and then there's a like operations research manager that falls under that.
Right. That's what I would imagine too. Thank you.
It would make sense.
All right, Jeff, you want to walk us briefly through the other sections, and then we'll circle back here to the options on A and B?
Sure. I was just going to chime in, and I might have said it a little bit differently than you, Paul, but I think I agree entirely, at least at first reading. I like option A a lot better. I think it's a lot cleaner in terms of the line of authority and reporting. I think it makes sense for the executive director to work for OSU, which is basically responsible for making all things happen there, and then tied to the dean and back up to the board of director or the advisors. To me, that makes a lot of sense, and just in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, and you don't sort of have this extra position, somewhat high level position of executive director hired separate outside of OSU. It's just my first read on it. Hey,
why don't we, since everybody's started to weigh in here, I'm good at ad-libbing and adapting. Let's just stick with this here a little bit. And Melissa, you haven't had a chance to weigh in yet. Do you have thoughts you'd want to share on it?
I think it seems like a false choice because, frankly, the executive director is free to hire a research director or any other positions that they believe are appropriate for the forest anyway. Looking at the research director, I don't see any particular roles that need to be outlined in statute. And maybe I'm just missing that, but it doesn't seem like a real choice to me. And so, of course, I'd choose A. Thank you.
Ditto. I was going to jump in before you decided we were going down this road anyway, Peter, so thanks.
You have something else you want to say, Keith?
No, just ditto. I agree.
Yeah.
I think that option A is the preferred option.
Anybody else, OSU team or anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I need to say that the land board, not the land board, I can't speak for the land board. The state and the vetting that we have done internally, we don't have any preference or opinion between option A or option B. DSL is not here at the table advocating for either. It really is the working group's direction for, as far as we're concerned.
And internal to College of Forestry, we have discussed this and feel that option A is the preferred option internally is within the college. I'm not speaking for Paul and Katie. I'll let them speak for themselves, but it just makes a lot more sense, and for numerous reasons, including those that have already been shared.
Yeah, I mean, just from the university side, I'd agree with what Tom said. I think we didn't want to come in though with just giving one option that really delegated, the kind of the management to the university or to the college. So wanted to come and kind of have a discussion with the group.
Yep. I agree with Katie. I think A is cleaner and better for the university. It gets, I guess the difference there, Melissa, we see is kind of that the executive director reporting and working through the dean versus directly to the board of directors, which I think is cleaner to keep the mission of the forest focused on where we want it to be.
Yeah, going back to Melissa's point on this, really, I think we could have framed up the two options to have said exactly the same thing, just the executive director reporting to the college versus the executive director reporting to the board, knowing that the staffing would have been done however the staffing is going to be done for research programs or operations. So.
And the hiring of that person, is that the same? Remind me, Jeff.
The hiring of the
ED.
The ED under option A is a university hire and university employee, unless people want to do something different about the employment, but it's clearly a university hire and supervision by the dean. And option B was meant to be board of directors hire supervised by the board of directors.
Yep.
Hired by the dean, but affirmed in the first one, affirmed by the board of directors.
Right. In Tom or any good dean is going to, at that point, at least involve the board in some sort of a rehire there if needed.
All right. Sounds like we have agreement on option A. Anything else on this?
I think we should have a little bit of feedback and discussion about land board role.
So then yeah, so I guess that was where I was going to go to is so the first question was A or B. Then if it is A, do folks have feedback about that in particular? And I did want to flag that one, especially Jeff, because it is new, the relationship with the land board.
I'm trying to get it on the screen there. I don't know. I'm sorry, I keep moving it around, guys.
It's on the bottom there.
Could you walk us through a scenario of how that would play out?
Sure. At least as it's written, that it would be at the request of either the board of directors or OSU, that there's a decision that's pending or a conflict or a dispute around the appropriate way to implement the mission and the long-term objectives of the forest. Some sort of discomfort either within the board or between the board and OSU, where there could be a process that's put in place and agreed to for kicking a question up to the land board for direction on the management of the forest, that would provide feedback that could help resolve an internal conflict or kind of make clear what the North Star is for directionally for making decisions around executing the mission that's identified in the statute. We didn't go into detail about what the process could be. In some structures, you can have a minority of board members that have been outvoted that really feel like that things aren't working the way it's supposed to, and a minority can ask for more direction from this Uber board or this outside policy board. Sometimes it could be a majority of board members are necessary, or any combination thereof. we didn't dig down into that. The main thing was to try and figure out a way not to have the land board make decisions on the management of the forest, but to provide guidance to the board of directors that's responsible for making the decisions.
It almost seems like it would be if there was a disagreement between the university and the board on a decision, and one or the other or both would go to mom and dad and say, can you settle this for us? I wouldn't see it as disputes amongst either side. Like if the board had a disagreement, I would think it would be to settle disagreements between the college and the board.
I guess as I think about it, I think the land board could resolve disagreements, but I guess I'd also like to think of it more in terms of affirmation and supporting what the university is doing. And so based on recommendations from the university and the advisory committee. So I think there's another piece, another half of it. I think the way it's written, it's a little limited, but you could have final approval based on recommendation of the advisory committee of OSU on hiring the ED, on the budgets or on the FMP, or if there was litigation, any final decisions on that. I guess I'd like to see not just the land board be put in the position of resolving disagreement or dispute, but rather to also be affirmative on some of the very high level things that presumably would be brought to the board based on recommendation of OSU in support of the board of directors.
Mark, I want to be careful there, though, that it's not a reach down, that the land board doesn't have the capacity to simply say, whoa, time out. We don't like this decision, or we don't like where this is going. If we're going that direction, I don't think that's a bad direction, but I don't think I want the land board simply to have the capacity to reach down and change policy that the university and the board of directors have agreed to. Or does that make sense? I mean, I probably didn't phrase that well, but do you get where I'm going?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it seems unlikely to me that the land board's going to want to reach down just because it's, I think by definition, they tend to operate at a higher level and they want things brought to them that they can support and endorse. And I think I could only see in a dispute would they be put in the position of having to reach down.
Yeah, I agree. It's unlikely, but I also can imagine that in some circumstance, political pressure on the land board or political pressure period leads the land board to reach down and to play in the Elliott, even if there's agreement between the board and the university. That's my concern.
I have that same fear, Keith. I mean, I've seen reach down from Washington, D.C. to the district level on the Forest Service. And it should have been beneath them, no pun intended, but they did it anyway. I would like to keep the land board's participation in the decision-making process an absolute minimum. That if there was something that the college and the board disagreed on, then they could arbitrate something like that. This is supposed to be separate from the land board. They don't have the time to get down in the weeds on this stuff, or they shouldn't. So I would really like to see that participation and authority limited.
Yeah, I hear what you guys are saying. I guess I'm just thinking, I think there also is so how does it connect to the higher level of the state and sort of ensuring the investment and the asset there. So maybe there's some nuances to exactly what they quote approve or don't approve, but I guess I'd like to see it be more than just a resolution of a dispute board.
Well, they're going to have the power to appoint, or the land board or something like the land board is going to have the power to appoint the board members of this organization, whatever it is. So I think that gives them a pretty good hammer.
You know, we were internally to the college just talking about the expanding that first bullet under board of directors and, you know, highlighting that entity, you know, that board holds the entity accountable to meeting all those guiding principles associated with the governance of the forest, the recreation, the education, partnerships, conservation and tribal engagement. And so it's just spelled out in that first bullet that the board has this responsibility to meeting that, you know, to ensuring that the entity meets those values and those objectives that were laid out by the land board in the research plan. Because it's just, the first bullet is oversight and operational and fiscal integrity, but it doesn't address that sort of larger.
Yeah.
And maybe that gets at some of what's being. Because then it emphasizes the board is doing the land board's bidding, making sure that the entity does what we said it would do.
I think it could be strength, you know, the board of directors, it doesn't say who appoints them. That could be added in there as one of the bullets. Whether it's the governor, which is what we talked about before.
It's a little further down, Mark. To your point, Tom, I think that was implied, but it was something we could have put in that first bullet, but I think it should be clear that the board is responsible for delivering on the mission, right? That's the intent of the governance structure.
And I think that's stated or unstated and understood. We need those bumpers, right? So that the board understands that it's not, that there's a mission and that has been laid out that the board holds to in some great degree.
Just for clarification, where are you saying under board of directors, it says appointed by the governor?
I will scroll down.
Under 5.
Membership composition in 5. So
Okay.
With a real desire, which we heard the last time and we've heard individually, to have the land board engaged at some level in mission related executing, kind of keeping the core mission and values of the forests front and center. If there's a problem, we constructed the appointment process to be a direct appointment from the land board, so that there's a continuing tie of the land board as an entity to the composition of the board of directors, as opposed to a single member of the land board being responsible for the tie. But that's something that you all should talk through. This also mentions refers to a slate of candidates developed by OSU and the board of directors. And I know that that doesn't necessarily reflect the breadth of views that we heard the last time around. And there are some folks that want that slate to be able to be developed in a little bit more broad way. So that needs to be discussed as well.
You want to just walk us through the remaining 2 pieces there, Jeff, and then we'll circle back.
Sure. I think we were distinguishing, and I think this is consistent with conversations before. How is the initial board going to be formed? And this just as it puts a point out that the process for the initial board, and it may be that it needs to be more specific or less specific than that, but that we are recognizing as separate from the ongoing appointment process. And then the advisory board, making sure that the board of directors has the capacity to form advisory boards and board subcommittees. We kind of heard that theme being expressed in your last meeting a couple of weeks
This is
ago.
as opposed to prescribing that in legislation.
As opposed to having the legislation say there will be an advisory body or subcommittees, just making sure that legislation is clear that the board of directors has the authority to create advisory bodies and subcommittees as it wishes.
Okay.
And then on the public accountability, open meetings laws apply, public records laws apply. We're comfortable and wanted to put on the table for you all to discuss, but the state's comfortable having the Oregon Administrative Procedures Act as it circumscribes third-party rights of judicial review for other than contested case orders. So that's the third-party right of review. We're comfortable there as long as it's the board of directors that is having the decision. The decisions are being made at the board of directors. And I think, Mark, this goes back a little bit to your desire to have the land board be making decisions. That is directly connected then to the Oregon Administrative Procedures Act. And with an agency, the body that's making the decision is the one that's subject to the judicial review of those decisions. And so it is problematic to have judicial review, a third-party right of action attached to a potential function of the land board when we're trying to have the executive, the board of directors be the decision-making body on some of these key documents. So that's part of why this is framed the way that it is. And there's more work to be done under the public accountability, but we're also looking to see how we can make sure that the principles of those first three bullets there are clear in the legislation without having the entity burdened by a whole lot of other parts of the Administrative Procedures Act that are really relevant to big agencies, DEQ, DSL, other state agencies that maybe have a lot more policy making happening in their mission than the Elliott State Forest would. So it might well be that the whole Administrative Procedures Act doesn't have to apply in order to account for the clarity we need on how do we accomplish a third-party right of action if in fact the board or OSU are implementing the forest management plan or biennial operations plans or something in a manner that's contrary to the statute. And in all of these, in the way this is structured, that would sit with the board of directors as the target of that judicial review for the decisions the board of directors is making. Anything else, Peter?
No, not other than looking for feedback from the group here. Things that concern you, questions you have, additional topics you'd like to raise. And obviously there's more work to be done.
Yeah, I guess just one thing I'm chewing on in terms of sort of public accountability. Obviously here it says it applies to the board of directors. And I'm just thinking out loud without trying to land it exactly, but, you know, are there any instances where that applies to how OSU is functioning within the forest as well as they manage it?
Say more, Mark.
I don't have a specific, but if there's some things that clearly OSU is responsible for rather than the board of directors, does any of the public accountability apply to OSU?
Under option A, the way we're contemplating the structure in order to fit with the desire to have the Administrative Procedures Act apply, the Board of Directors is ultimately responsible for OSU's implementation of the decisions the board's made on the forest. So if the board approves a biennial operations plan and that's not being followed, the Board of Directors is responsible for helping right the ship on that.
But Jeff, the big stuff, the HCP and FMP, that still lays on the university, not the board, right?
No, under option A, the board of, actually under both options, the Board of Directors is responsible for the regulatory compliance on the forest.
Okay.
And Executive Director is responsible for implementing that. But you would be, that is why there was an option B, because that's the difference, the nuance of the difference between option A and option B. So the board is always responsible, but who is going to be hiring the executive director that's charged with implementing that responsibility?
Okay, thanks.
Paul?
I need to remember to take myself off mute before I engage my mouth. Or not. Or yeah, well, that's true. that's true. I mean, under either option, the board is a responsible party, I would think. And you know, they're approving what OSU is doing. So ultimately it's the board's decision. And if there is litigation, it's going to be against not the individuals, I guess, but is against the board as a whole. So, which makes sense to me.
Yeah, I guess I'm still struggling a little bit with, you know, we had conversations earlier on about, you know, what this entity would look like and did we need an entity or not? And now, not sure that we fully resolved that, but we're putting building blocks on. Well, now we're going to have a board of directors, which seems to say, you know, we're going to have a public corporation. And so all of a sudden it's feeling layered, but not necessarily layered on something that we had agreed upon firmly. So it's, I guess I'm struggling with the building blocks that we have here a little bit.
I'm not sure I see that as necessitating a public corporation at all. I mean, we're all involved in organizations where there's boards of directors and not necessarily a corporative setup. And so unless I'm misreading what you're saying, then I'm not sure I agreed that it absolutely necessitates a public corporation.
Well, maybe who owns the forest? Is the land board going to own the forest? Well, then who owns? Paul, I mean, I see you shaking your head, but OSU is not going to own the forest. So where does that ownership lie?
It lies in whatever entity we create to own it, whatever entity it's transferred to, and I personally see the cleanest way to do that is this public corporation concept. They will own it. They will be responsible for approving management. And if they're wrong, they'll be the subject to litigation.
Jeff and Melissa, so just an off the wall question. Does it make a difference? I mean, if the if the way the legislation is structured, and does it make a difference whether the public corporation or the state owns the forest, as long as the legislation and as long as the mission is clear enough to know that operative decisions are at a level below that, at a board and ED level. So
I think as we were mapping this out, there were three options that are available to go forward for the forest. One is to have the forest subsumed by an existing state agency or public body that already exists. One is to create a new public entity that is similar to a state agency, but is really just in mission, goals, authorities in legislation established to run the Elliott. And the third is to create a public authority on the order of the Willamette Locks Authority, or something that we've talked about before, that is created in legislation for the purpose of managing the Elliott. And from the state's perspective, there was a strong desire to not have the Elliott subsumed into an existing state agency. And once you tie the Oregon Administrative Procedures Act to this endeavor, there has to be an entity that is making decisions and is charged with implementing the legislation. And so we're really at a choice between a public agency type entity, not like the South Slough, but kind of modeled in a similar fashion, and we've talked about that, or a public authority that is somewhat similar or modeled slightly after the Willamette Locks Authority.
okay, I agree that we don't want the less we keep the agencies out, the better off we all are. And so that's worth avoiding, I think.
We can if we were to go to an existing agency, we inherit all their baggage. And if we're gonna create something new and different and successful, I think we need to get away from those agencies, and I think we need to get away from being a new state agency. I don't, because we inherit a lot of other things in doing that. So I think the cleanest way is something, and I don't quite understand what the slough, how it's structured, so I can't speak to that. So I know how a public corporation works, so I understand that, so I like that idea. But maybe if I knew more about how the other was structured, I might be swayed that direction. But right now I'm still thinking of a public corporation.
And I guess from our perspective has been, that's a decision that can, once we identify and align on what the structure looks like and how the decisions would be reached, and the Department of Justice and legal counsel for OSU kind of work through their list of what are the technical things to be worked through. It might be that there are advantages to one over the other, but that we can figure that out once we figure out what you want it to look like and do.
Mark, what does that open-ended process look like for your folks?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to say it again. I'm getting between the chat and the text box here on my phone. I missed that last piece there, so maybe someone could repose that.
Welcome to my world, Mark.
Yeah.
So my question was, what does that look like if, I think Jeff had said, and I'll paraphrase him poorly, that there's a possibility that that ultimate ownership of the Elliott could be sort of delayed until we had a better sense of governance. Did I say that well, Jeff, or just
I think, yeah,
entirely badly?
we figure out all of the pieces and what we want and how they fit together, and then we can look to see what the structure is that between the public entity and a public authority that really makes the most sense to the group.
And
to
so-
what we should do in the state.
Then my question, Mark, was what does an open-ended process look like to your folks?
Well, I think it's, it's an open-ended process, so it's punting a little bit, but that's, that could be a good thing in this case. Could work.
Okay.
And it sounds like the SLU is part of DSL.
The SLU is an example of a public entity or agency that's created for a very specific purpose. Its documents tie it to DSL and the land board more than it would have to be, and that we would like to see.
Yeah.
So I think, Keith, to circle back to the topic that you were raising there, I think an important piece of that is even if you punted on sort of what the entity might look like or how to structure it, this group would have to be in alignment around the idea of creating an entity, right? I think that's a fundamental piece of this conversation. And so I want to be explicit about that. And I'm not sure, without Bob here, and I think folks are still mulling on this, but I think it's important for us to talk that through and make sure folks are in alignment on that. Or if that's a sideboard for the conversation, we need to know that. And then I think I have a couple of other topics I want to circle back to, but I guess any reactions to that statement or observation, I'd be curious.
I'm willing to walk that through, if that's a question. And I think I was concerned that it was a particular speed bump for Mark's folks, to leave that open-ended. And so that was my question to him. And if it is, then it's probably for Bob's folks too. And in the folks that they speak for. But I'd like us to get this right, and then we can kind of figure out what, and then I'm agnostic in some sense to what that as long as we don't belong to an agency. I'm completely with Paul. I mean, maybe we are an agency, or the Elliott is an agency. But if you're simply a part of the Oregon Department of Forestry or the, I think we need to avoid that, because Paul said it really well. We just inherit their headaches and their biases all the way through. So I'll shut up.
No, it's helpful. Thanks, Keith. Mark?
Yeah, I guess one question is, could you have a South SLU-like entity that just, is under the land board without being connected to DSL?
Jeff, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, we have a lot of flexibility with how the South SLU entity type thing could be connected to the land board without DSL being an administrative arm of the South SLU. But again, when we tie to the Administrative Procedures Act, the entity that's making the decisions is a very key piece of what's being delineated, and what we're bringing to you today reflects that we want that decision body to be the board of directors.
So just to help me understand it, is where ADA applies simply tied to the decision maker? So in other words, whether it was OSU or this entity or the land board, is that sort of in statute as to where Oregon Administrative Procedures Connect?
I'm not sure I'd be comfortable going down in the weeds that far with you right now, Mark. I'm not sure I'm the right person to do that. Generally speaking, the statute is, our legislative concept has to be really clear where the decisions for oversight of the forest are going to reside. And the legislative concept has, that's the key decision that needs to be made as we're framing a legislative concept. And I think that's the essence of the discussion.
Okay.
Hey, this is Bob. I've been trying to get on for the last hour, so I apologize. I'm out of the middle of the desert in a storm, so I've driven about 60 miles to get on. My apologies for being an hour late.
Glad you're here, Bob.
Made some great decisions.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. And I've been driving down the highway swearing, so we're down Turbo swearing, trying to get on. So you were in a better place than I was.
So, Bob, we can circle back with you afterwards, and fill you in on the conversation. One, I think, important thing for you to know was in terms of options A and B on the document that I know you had a chance to look at. Option A was the preference of the group, and having discussions now sort of related to what type of entity and relationship to state agency and or land board and accountability mechanisms and their relationship.
Okay, great.
I'll
catch up.
Great. Anything you'd want to just jump in with real quick, high level observations about how you've been thinking about the concept at this point?
Talking to several people so they know. I mean, I guess my hope is that we find something that clearly delineates the responsibilities so that there's not a lot of entities stepping on other entities. I think simplicity is helpful. From our perspective, land board retaining high level authority is critical. So, you know, we've put out there that our idea really is sort of a land board with high-level decision-making, some sort of advisory committee or board of stakeholders between the land board and then OSU, really holding the management pretty much in its entirety, including, FMP and so on, with the land board just having kind of final approval as opposed to really getting down in the weeds on that stuff. So I don't want to belabor it here. I know you all been talking about it for the last 40 minutes, so I don't want to be redundant.
Bob, I'll jump in. Our concern here and part of this discussion was that the land board's role was not a reach down, that they couldn't reach into the Elliott or reach into the governance of the Elliott in a manner that superseded the board or the ED. How's that play with what you're saying?
Well, I mean, I think the state does have to have some sort of final authority. The state is retaining full liability for this forest. And, you know, I mean, assuming that things are consistent with the plans, then yes, I agree. But to the degree that there is conflict or, you know, questionable decisions, you know, I think it's important that the state still have that. I also think that we're talking about 70 years here, and things evolve over 70 years. You know, we go back 70, 80 years, and we're talking about post-World War II. So, you know, I think there's going to be some recognition that OSU chose not to take, in which case it would have that kind of complete control that they still understandably want, but where ultimate responsibility for this forest is going to live with the state, I think the state has to have some level of authority here and accountability. I think we can write a document that does circumscribe that fairly carefully and sends a clear message. But we are talking about decades and decades. None of us has been on this planet, I think, as long as we're talking about this thing existing. So, I think fixing ourselves in time to too much of a degree only makes so much sense here.
If the land board or the governor or whoever we decide has the ultimate authority to appoint this board of directors, isn't that the ultimate control over the decision-making process? For one thing, it isn't going to be in the ownership of DSL. And so why would they have the decision-making authority? I mean, we can ask them to settle disputes, but they shouldn't have continued authority to make the decisions.
I think because, it is a public forest, and because, appointed boards only have so much accountability at the end of the day. I think elected officials have more accountability. And I just want to make sure, I guess in my idealized vision, the board and OSU would be synced up with these various documents that we're creating. And at that point, the land board or whoever that final authority is should be approving these things, unless there's something in there that really runs contrary to the state's interests. And I think that is a possibility with something like this. So I'm not sure exactly how to circumscribe that, but for us, because OSU chose not to take it, the land board remains a pretty critical piece of that puzzle.
Just for clarification, Bob, did you actually say that politically elected officials are accountable to the public? Did you actually say that?
Well, you can't really see my facial expression, so you don't really know whether I'm serious or not. Yeah, no, I mean, being serious here, I think, I think these appointed boards are useful. I think if they operate right, the bulk of decision making really should reside with them. But I think ultimately elected officials are the safety net of something like this. So, and I think we have models to look at as well. So, again, I want to catch up on things and see where the conversation has been before I go off too much here.
Well, and we are up against time, and I guess, Jeff, do you want to maybe stop sharing while we just wrap up here? I want to remind folks that because we only have an hour for these meetings, public comment, DSL's hosting separate public comment meetings for legislative concepts on Wednesdays from, I believe, 4 to Tuesdays, 4 to 5. Information's on the DSL website if you want to provide comments. Obviously, all the advisory committee members and others are willing to listen in here and receive input between meetings. My sense is that we're at a place in the conversation where both more discussion, but also continuing to have something to react to, something tangible, is probably helpful. And the words and subtleties around some of these things is going to be really important. And so there's probably value in continuing to sort of put pen to paper and work with folks to better massage the language to ensure that's reflecting all of your interests and where you want to land on this. I do want to flag, a couple of folks have said that next week Friday afternoon does not work for them. So we'll have to figure out whether and how to have that meeting. And if we don't, the following week on Tuesday, we have a longer, I think 4-hour window on November 2nd, if I'm not mistaken. So that we'd have some time to really dig in together on this, and hoping that that can be a fruitful time, particularly if we can't meet next week, Friday. So know that in the meantime, we will be in touch with you and try to continue to have conversations, continue to work on language. If you have suggestions on language, that's always welcomed. And Jeff, hoping that you can continue to sort of be the consolidator of that information. And any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Who's
Yeah,
this
one more
Brett
on
Brown?
this issue. Again, sorry.
Oh, I just want to know who this Brett Brownscombe character is that's on this.
He's standing in for Bob Van Dyke, as I understand it, because Bob is unavailable.
And very curious about where this is going, and always good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you.
No public comment from me.
Okay.
So I guess I just don't think we have the luxury of time here. And I think, you know, if this is where we're really sticking, I think we got to find time. And next week is, Peter, as you know, is really bad with OFBA stuff. But I think we got to double down on this early next week.
Yep.
We can go back and forth on emails, and that's fine. But I feel like we got to get through it, and I think we got to do it next week, and early next week.
You can't see everybody's heads, but I think folks are nodding in agreement. Pedal to the metal. Now's the time.
It doesn't get any easier, right? It's just, time doesn't buy us anything here.
No.
So
I do think we're circling in on some concepts that folks are gonna find acceptable and be supportive of. So it's easy to forget how far we've traveled already, and to get to here. And I think we're in the home stretch. So thanks everybody for hanging in there. Thanks for your engagement today on a Friday afternoon. Hope you all have a nice weekend. We'll post any updates on the website for the public if meetings are canceled and whatnot. And be in touch about next week. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Adios all.
So.